Hi, Jen.
Hi, Monet. How are you?
Good. I've had a busy week. I've had, I think, two births, three births, maybe. Yeah, three clients this week. And so it's been a lot of birth activity. And I finally got a good night of sleep last night. So I'm feeling much more refreshed today. How are you?
I'm good. I'm about in the same position. I had two births over the weekend and a family wedding. So I had a birth and then I went to this wedding and then I left and went to a birth. So it was a lot. And I'm just finally feeling like I'm catching up on sleep and just like feeling back to myself. But of course, I still have three other clients that are potentially having their babies soon. So, that's how it goes.
Yep, on our toes always.
Hmm.
We're hoping to sneak this recording in before my next client. I have someone that's getting her membrane swept today. So I'm assuming that I'll go to her birth sometime this afternoon or evening. But yeah, we are super excited to be here today. We're going to be talking about free birth, which I think will be an interesting contrast to the discussion we had last week about cesarean birth. So we are really grateful that you are here today, and we can't wait to share our thoughts. And as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. So please reach out to us via email or social media because we want this to be a two-way conversation. So let's get into it. Hi, it's Monet and Jen, and we are the co-founders of Birth Becomes You. We are birth photographers and doulas with over 10 years of experience. We've attended over 1,000 births collectively. We started Birth Becomes You to create a safe space for new and experienced birth photographers to share and grow. We aim to equip and empower birth workers to feel confident in the birth space and take beautiful, world-changing images. We believe in a world where birth is visible, where shame is absent, where fear is translated to power, and where each individual's experience is honored as valid and valued. We are so glad you're here, and we can't wait to learn and connect with you.
We are so glad that you joined us for the debut of our podcast. And to thank our first listeners, we are offering an exclusive promotion of 25% off any item in the shop through the end of July. To redeem it, you can go to birthbecomesyou.com and click on the shop in our menu and use promo code podcast25 at checkout. That's promo code podcast25 when you check out. We have tons of items in the shop that include toolkits and contracts for birth photographers, toolkits for new birth photographers to teach you how to photograph your own birth and step into the birth space for the very first time. We also have presets, we have mentoring, we have a whole host of things. So head on over to our shop at birthbecomesyou.com and use code podcast25 at checkout. Thank you so much. All right, let's go. Do you want to talk a little bit about like what a free birth is first? I think that's
Yeah,
probably the
I
best.
think the definition is probably important. And, I think we could spend a lot of time honestly going into the history of free birth and the way that it's looked throughout time. This is not necessarily a new idea or a new concept. People have been birthing by themselves for many, many years, probably, for hundreds and hundreds of years. But I do think that in the last, I don't know, I would say 5 years, we have seen a rapid increase in people who are deciding to free birth or to birth unassisted. I think it was for a long time pretty fringe and you didn't hear about it very often. And now in our Facebook group, we hear about free birth all the time. I would say, once a week, somebody's asking a question about free birth and should I go to a free birth? What does it mean for me as a birth photographer? And so it's definitely something that people are choosing more and more. And essentially, you're just giving birth, usually with yourself and your partner, maybe. Sometimes there is an additional support person, but they're not a trained medical birth attendant. So you're not having a traditional midwife. You may have a doula, but that doula is not technically doing anything that would be clinical or medical. They're just there as emotional support.
Mhm.
People that free birth really believe that they alone should be responsible for their bodies. There's a lot of like talk about sovereignty and bodily autonomy, and that they alone should be making decisions for themselves and their baby. They acknowledge that there is some inherent risk in giving birth, and there's some inherent risk in giving birth at home. But in their mind, that is much more preferable than the risks of going into the hospital or hiring a traditional midwife or a certified midwife that is answering to not only the client, but also to the state, honestly, or a regulatory board that determines what you can or can't do as a midwife. So I think that's kind of a brief overview. And like I said, it used to be something that I didn't hear about often at all. And now I hear about
Mhm.
it all the time. And so it's definitely becoming a big issue within the birth community. And you'll hear people with all sorts of opinions about it. You know, you tell this to like an OB or a labor and delivery nurse, and they will look at you like, it's the worst thing that they have ever heard of in their life. You tell it to a certified midwife, and they also might be really upset about it because, as you can imagine, sometimes these births don't go as planned. And if they have to go into the hospital, some certified midwives worry that that can actually negatively impact relationships with hospital providers, just because so often hospital providers don't necessarily differentiate between, a birth with a trained midwife, an unassisted birth. Home birth is kind of just this one term that gets, placed on a lot of
Around.
different types, yeah,
Mhm.
of births. And so anyway, I would say it's a controversial topic. And I think people have a lot of different opinions and feelings about it. And so we thought it would be good to talk about it because as birth photographers, we're obviously not medical providers. And many of us have been asked to attend free births, have attended free births, or will be asked to attend free births. So we wanted to just share some of our experiences and some things for you all to consider if you are asked to attend a free birth, because you will be. There's
At
just,
some point. Yeah.
at some point you will be.
I think we should at least start a little bit and talk about why we're seeing more free births, because I do think that even though that's not specifically the topic, like that is why all of this is on trend, right? We're seeing less and less options. We're seeing options being taken away in a lot of areas. I know here locally, midwives and birth centers have been closing and midwives are being pushed out of hospitals. Was a really popular birth center here called the ABC Birth Center. And it's where a lot of people went to have their babies. And now that birth center is closed. You can only go to a hospital with an OB in that area. And that's a big deal for people. It's a huge, like, this is Southfield, Michigan. This is just outside of Detroit. So this is a really big area. And that's just speaking about one place in my area. We know we see this all over the country. I mean, it's not changing. It's only getting worse. Like options are being taken away. So of course people are going to come up with, other options for themselves, right? Like if you don't want to give birth in the hospital with an OB and you don't have another option, a free birth starts to sound like a good option to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's not even necessarily the lack of like options in terms of there's not midwives or there's not birth centers. I think a lot of people are frustrated by some of the rules and regulations that midwives have to follow. And it's important to know, at least in the United States, that these regulations change state by state. So something that is completely quote unquote legal for a home birth midwife to do in Utah is illegal for a home birth midwife to do in Colorado. And so you see situations in which, you know, there's state rules saying, you have to, if you want to give birth at home with a midwife, the midwife needs to follow these rules. And some of the rules, I think the rules by and large are trying to make sure that the people staying at home are low risk, but
Mhm.
there's always variations of normal, right? And so I have had plenty of clients who reach 42 weeks and they are not in labor. And here in Colorado, if you are a certified midwife in the state of Colorado, you have to transfer care to a hospital provider. Now, these people, nothing's wrong with them, nothing's wrong with their baby. Everyone is healthy. In all likelihood, they would go into labor probably sometime in that 42nd week. But because of state law, that is not an option. And so, as you can imagine, if you've been planning a home birth your entire pregnancy and you have been envisioning this intervention free birth, and then suddenly you get to 41 weeks, 41 and a half weeks, 42 weeks, and your midwife comes to you and says, I'm sorry, my hands are tied. We have to go to the hospital. You have to be induced. I think that it's not unreasonable for people to say, I don't want to do that. And right now, because of social media, because of podcasting and TikTok, there's a wealth of discussion and dialogue about, hey, there's another option. If you don't want to go into the hospital, you could just give birth at home. You could do a free birth. And there's, like I said, a lot of information about free birthing. There's a lot of people that are like really into free birthing and are huge advocates for it. And so it can seem like this awesome option. It's like, okay, well, I can still have my home birth. I have all the supplies. I'm just going to do it myself. This is going to go well. And I think the tricky thing about free birth is that it does go well. It does go well. I think birth, when left undisturbed, birth goes well the vast majority of the time. The
Mhm.
problem is that there are times when it doesn't. And there are times when the help of a trained and knowledgeable midwife or birth professional can make a huge difference. And so that for me, as someone who always supports bodily autonomy, and I always think people should be able to choose what they want to choose for their births. I thought about having a free birth myself. So I'm not saying that this is a bad choice for anybody, but I
Mhm.
am saying that, you know, in a lot of the chatter and talk that I see in the free birth community, sometimes there is a lack of acknowledgement of complications that can and do happen. And, there are some things that you can't, there's some situations that are just completely out of everybody's control that a midwife or an OB couldn't save or do anything to help. But there are numerous situations or complications where that training can make a difference and can save somebody's life. And so sometimes I worry that people aren't necessarily understanding the full risk of what they are entering into,
Mhm.
also acknowledging that the vast majority of the time it goes super smoothly and free birth can be a really uncomplicated option for lots of people.
Mhm. And I do think some of that risk maybe isn't something that the birthing person knows of at the time. Like you don't necessarily know if you're bleeding too much, if you're just paying attention to your baby in that moment, or you might not know necessarily if the baby's head is kind of out for a long time because you're really in the moment and it's having somebody who's in the birth space. Now, it doesn't have to be a midwife necessarily, but just somebody who can say, this is what's happening and speaking that out loud. I do think that's important. And I don't always see that in the free birth, like births that I've attended. And I think that's an important piece to talk about. Sometimes you're really tired in birth, and sometimes you're just going by how you're feeling in the moment and you're not really paying attention to the medical aspects that are happening because there are some medical aspects that are happening at every birth.
Right.
Would you say that's
Yeah. I mean, I think that, obviously there are many wonderful midwives that do, I think, really center the birthing person and really help them make choices for their birth that, it's not like this top down, like I'm going to be the decision maker here and
right? That's kind of what I
follow
mean.
me.
Yes, exactly.
But I think that there are times in births where, like you said, the birthing person, the mom, is exhausted. They are completely depleted. And what they really need in that moment is a midwife or anybody to step in and say, hey, you're really close to having your baby. These are some things that I think might help you get to that point. Let's try this or let's do this. I see with a free birth, like I said, it goes really well, but then when it doesn't go well, I think it can be really defeating for the people that have to go into the hospital or have to transfer because suddenly they feel like, gosh, like, did I fail? Like, did I make a mistake? Am I good enough? It's a really, for me, a really gray area. And I think that's something that you and I talk about a lot, Jen,
Yeah.
privately, is that I think the free birth world often makes a lot of these decisions very black and white. Like, okay, you're free birthing, you're not getting assistance. You can't even talk about assistance. Like there are groups where if you talk about like
Oh,
suggesting
yeah.
someone,
Yeah.
you get kicked out.
Yeah.
So it's a very black and white mentality where this is the only way to do it. And if you choose another option, you are setting yourself up for obstetrical violence, for birth rape. I mean, the language that they use is very extreme. A lot of these folks, to be perfectly honest, have not attended very many births. They've attended a handful of births, they've attended their own births. As someone, collectively, Jen and I, we've probably seen 1,000 births. And I will tell you that birth is wild. It's mysterious. It does not always make sense. It is not always fair. It is not always right. I wish that it was. I wish we could follow this, these set rules and guarantee a healthy baby and a healthy mom, healthy birthing person. But that's not how birth always works. For us as experienced birth workers, I think the concern comes in when we get to this black and white thinking of like, this is the only way to do it. And if you get any help, or if you use a midwife, or if you go to the hospital, then you've essentially failed. And that is not the reality that I want to live in, or the reality that I want to be part of personally.
Mm-hmm.
So that's some of the controversy. And again, like I said, Jen and I fully support, and we always will fully support all of our clients and our community to choose whatever feels right to them, even if it's a choice we wouldn't make, even if we have some reservations about it. I firmly believe that the person giving birth knows what is best for themselves, for their family, for their baby. But at the same time, I think as a culture and as like a community, I think the birth community, we have to wrestle with how we're talking about free birth and some of the black and white language that people are using to talk about that option or choice. And on the other side, there's people that say that free birth is totally wrong. And it's like, the worst thing you could do. And you're putting your baby at risk and you're an awful parent. And I think that's just as damaging and just
Yeah.
as dangerous as the other side. So again,
Just black and white again.
right. It's exactly. So I think, we're here to kind of sit in the messy middle, the gray area where we acknowledge both sides. And we, again, want to really give our clients and our community the support they need to make the choice that feels most aligned with them and their values, right? My values are going to be different than somebody else's values. And so I think that's important to recognize as a birth photographer and a birth worker. But here's the complication. While, yes, we support everybody's choices and we fully believe in bodily autonomy, we have to decide how and if we are going to document, support free birth. Because, like we said, you're going to be asked to do it and you've got to figure out what you feel about it.
Mm-hmm. And
Tricky.
that decision might change. You
Yeah.
might like do a free birth and be all for a free birth and then decide that maybe that wasn't for you or vice versa. I think that decision for me has changed over time. 10 years ago, when we started doing this, we would hear, about a free birth maybe a couple times a year. And I think the response, not necessarily from me, but from the birth photography community is, well, you probably don't want to put yourself in that position because then you would be taking photos, you would be liable. You're probably the most experienced person in that room. What are you going to do if something goes wrong? How are you going to manage it? And how are you going to manage it with the family, with yourself, with the baby, like all of these things? I think at least for me, early on in my career, I don't know that I could have done it in a way that I could have attended somebody's birth and been like a positive presence for them, because the most important thing we are doing here is documenting without our feelings and emotions present in the space. Like we can't be afraid of a free birth and then go to a free birth. That's just
Right.
it's not the right thing to do for anybody, yourself or your clients. And now my feeling on that has changed a lot over the years. And if it's the right client, I do feel a little bit more comfortable going now, but every single time, you have to think about it. You have to think about all of the situations that can arise and what are you going to do if you are asked to help or if something does go wrong? And are you going to be able to live with that situation? And that's something that you have to ask yourself. There's no right or wrong answer. It all
Right.
comes from you and it all comes from your relationship with the people and the family giving birth.
Absolutely. I agree. I think that my feelings about attending free births have changed and evolved. And to be honest, I think you mentioned this, Jen, it's a pretty fluid feeling. I
Mm.
might feel really comfortable doing a free birth this month, and then there might be a few months down the road where I'm not in the right space emotionally to go into that birth. Again, I've seen a lot, and I think you've seen a lot too, Jen, and we've been in a lot of really tricky, emergent,
Intense
intense
situations.
situations.
Yeah.
And,
Both at home and at the hospital. It doesn't
absolutely.
matter where you're at.
Right.
Like, I want to
Absolutely.
take that out of it. Some of the
Yeah.
scariest stuff I've seen is in a hospital.
Right.
So, yeah, take that piece out of it because
Yeah.
it can happen anywhere.
But you do have to, if you're going to do a free birth, you need to be able to go into that space and not be bringing a lot of fear or anxiety, because I do think that that negatively impacts everybody in the room. If you are the person in the corner that is like freaking out and, panic texting your birth photographer friends, like that's probably not the space for you to be in. But I think it is important to realize that, usually when people decide to free birth, they will tell you and they will believe like, look, like I'm going to accept all responsibility for this. I am going to make the call. I will be the one in charge. And by and large, that is what happens. But there are always situations where things go haywire, and I've been at births where this has happened. And Jen, I know you have too, where what was expected was so drastically different than what happened. And sometimes what seemed like a very easy, like, okay, they're going to make the call, they're going to make the choice. It's very black and white. Again, birth is not black and white. And so there have been situations where, oh shit, like someone is bleeding, someone is hemorrhaging. They're not conscious. What do I do? Do I call 911? Do I listen to what they said because they told me not to call 911? That can happen in birth. And so you have to ask yourself, am I, do I feel comfortable and confident enough to go into this birth space and potentially be faced with that kind of a decision? And again, I think that's why it comes back
Mm.
to relationship. I have clients who are now like dear friends to me. They're like best friends. And if they told me like, hey, Monet, I want to do a free birth, I would say yes without a question because we have such a deep relationship. It's more than just like they've hired me to be their photographer. They're truly my friend. And in that situation, I would feel far more comfortable to enter that space than somebody that found me on Google or through social media who I don't really know very well. I think that in that situation, it sometimes is a little bit harder for me to feel comfortable in my ability to enter that birth space and know what they would want me to do if an emergency happened. With my friends, like if Jen told me I'm gonna have a free birth, I'd say, okay, cool, I'll show up. And I know Jen well enough that I have a pretty good idea if things got wild, what she would want me to do. And
Mhm.
we have the relationship where if after the fact she was like, Monet, you did this, it really pissed me off, we'd be like, okay, I'm sorry. And we would be able to like, we
You
would
work through it.
process that. And so in a lot of ways, I do think, and I think even the free birth folks would say this, so, this is kind of part of their movement, is that hiring a stranger to come to your birth may not be the best fit for a free birth. You may want to
Mhm.
find someone that is a close friend, someone that you have those shared values with, that you have that, friendship before and after the birth to kind of help you navigate some of these difficult choices. So, again, we don't want to tell anybody, including birth photographers in our community, what to do, but we do want to really make you consider and think like things get crazy at birth. And if a baby's not breathing or if a mom is bleeding out, are you going to be okay just sitting there with your camera? You may or may not, you know? And so
Mhm.
I think those are things you really want to really think about. And in all reality, it's going to go fine. It's not going to be a problem, going to be a smooth birth, but there are absolutely cases where it is not. And that's just birth. And I hate to say that, but that is reality.
hmm And I think you have to have those conversations with your clients too, even if it's not a close friend and, a client reaches out and hires you and it does feel like the right situation. Like you need to be on the phone with that person and talking to them and just, figuring out where they are on some of these, like on some of the things that could potentially happen. Like where do they fall? If I'm bleeding, do you want, a shot of pit or do you want somebody to tell you, hey, that's too much blood? Like, you really need to have a conversation with somebody before you're stepping into their space like that. You need to know what they want, who in that room is going to make those decisions.
Right.
Because if it's not the person giving birth, is it the partner? Is it the friend that's in the space? Is it the grandma? Like, who is it? And you want to be able to be comfortable like Monet said, just all around. If those decisions have to be made, that you can make them and nobody's going to get upset later on. Like,
Right.
oh, you called 911 and I probably didn't need it and we sent the ambulance away, but hey, like I was safe. Thank you for doing that. Versus you called 911. I wish you hadn't done that. Now we owe $1,200. Like or whatever. You really do need to think about these things. This
Yeah.
is the reality of it. And even hearing this now, if you have not attended many births and you're just like, birth is going to be fine, it's going to be fine. Like, there are going to be times where you see something and it's not fine. So
Yeah.
you just have to be aware of that.
Yeah, I think that's so true, Jen. Another thing that, I was thinking about for me, a red flag for me at least right now. I think that there are people that choose free birth because it's like a philosophy that they've bought into. It aligns
Yeah.
with their values. And then there are people that are choosing free birth because they have risked out of the care of their midwife and they have decided kind of in a panicked response like I don't want to go to the hospital. I guess
Mhm.
I'm just going to give birth
At home.
unassisted.
Yeah.
Or perhaps there's a big financial situation and they can't afford to buy to have a midwife come to their birth. Those are two very different
Yeah.
camps of people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the people that are choosing free birth because it's like philosophically what they believe in deep down, they tend to be very educated and they tend to have a very strong sense of like personal responsibility. And I am going to be the one that makes the call. I am going to be the one that is in charge of this whole thing versus someone that's kind of getting pressured into free birth because their options have been taken away. I find that those folks, they really wanted a midwife. They hired a midwife, right? Like they went into their pregnancy and their birth wanting a midwife. And so they're choosing this option because unfortunately, state regulations are making them choose this option. But I think deep down, they want a midwife. And so if things go south or if things get out of control, those folks I find do look for somebody in the room to help them to step into that midwife role.
Mhm.
And, as someone like me, I've been to a lot of births. I've seen lots of shoulder dystocias resolved. I've seen lots of hemorrhages resolved. I have a pretty good knowledge about a lot of things, but I am not trained to handle any of those. I've never helped
Right.
a baby that was stuck in
Exactly.
a true shoulder dystocia get out, get unstuck. If that person looks at me with panic in their eyes and says, "Oh my God, Monet, can
Right.
you like step in?" Oh my, that's not something that I personally am comfortable with. So I think you have to really think about that. If someone reaches out to you about free birth, why are they
Mhm.
doing a free birth? And if things do turn, are they going to be looking to the most experienced birth worker in the room? And in a lot of cases, you are probably the
That's
most
you.
experienced birth worker.
Mhm.
And so those are things that you really want to consider. So, say, you get an inquiry, it's a free birth. I think the best thing to do, if you're kind of like in the area that we are, in a little bit of area of gray, is to just start a conversation. Talk to them on the phone, meet for coffee. You will probably get a really good sense right away if you feel like, okay, this feels like a good fit. I feel like we're on the same page. If you have any hesitancy, like it's okay to say no. Like it is
Mhm.
really important in this work. I believe that every single birthing person has bodily autonomy. And I also believe every birth worker has the
Has
autonomy
that
to say
autonomy too.
no when
Yeah.
they don't feel comfortable.
And we need to say that more. Like, I think that's so important. Like,
Right.
you're not abandoning somebody if this is making you feel very uncomfortable too. You're not the right person for that situation. And
Absolutely.
maybe this is a good like lead into, what if plans change? What if, just like you said, somebody had a midwife, the midwife said, "You are not low risk anymore. I cannot take you. You need to go to the hospital." And the client says, "I don't want to go to the hospital. I'm going to have a free birth." And then the client reaches out to you to tell you this because they're a great client and they want to tell you, how their birth is going and how things are changing. And you have to make a decision then too.
Yeah.
Do you still feel comfortable being the person in that space? Or
Yeah.
would you, rather not attend that birth? And how do you reconcile that with your client? I think we had this almost same situation in group just this week or today or yesterday. It was an anonymous post where somebody said, "This birth situation changed. Now they're doing a free birth. I'm not sure if I feel comfortable with this because of A, B, and C. What would you do? How do
Yeah.
you handle it?" And
Right.
I think that's a conversation we hear at least monthly now.
Right.
What would you do?
I think that, it's interesting when I think about birth work and, sexuality, it's all tied in together. And, we talk a lot about consent and how if it's not a full yes, if you're not feeling like, yes, this feels really right, then that's a no. And you should
Yeah.
articulate that and feel okay in setting up that boundary. And
Hmm.
so I think if you're feeling that hesitation, if you're not sure, if you're uncomfortable, then do yourself a favor and do your client a favor. I've been in that situation and I have
Yeah.
told the client, and this is true, I believe it. Like, I am so happy that you're making this choice for you and I support your bodily autonomy. And I don't want you to feel like I'm abandoning you, but I am just not in the right space right now and the right place right now to support you in the way that you need to be supported. And so I have to say no. And you don't have to judge their choices. You don't have to tell them scary stories. You don't have to make them feel bad. But just as we tell our clients, you have a right to say no to any intervention that you're not comfortable with. We have to practice that ourselves. We have a right to say no if we're no longer comfortable. I think you say no. I think you say no in a way that, again, it's not judgmental. You can offer to do, like, I'm happy to come and do a fresh 48 session after baby is here. If you know people in your community that are comfortable doing free births, you can always list those names and give those names out. But I would only give names to folks that know what they're getting into. Sometimes
Yeah.
there's new
I
birth
I would check
photographers,
in. I would
yeah,
check with my
that are
backup.
like,
Be like, "Are
that's
you okay with this? If
right.
so, I'll pass along your name. If
Right. You don't
not."
want to give this to like a new birth photographer who's excited because it's like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
I want to go to a birth. And it can be very exciting to get any kind of inquiry if you're new. I just don't think it's a good space for a new birth photographer to be in. I really don't, unless it's a close friend, unless it's somebody that you have that established relationship with, that makes all the difference. But if this is like purely a professional situation, I think this is a more advanced, experienced birth photographer situation.
Yeah.
And like Jen said at the beginning, it's okay if you're like, there are times where you feel comfortable doing it, and there are times when you don't feel comfortable doing it. I had a really horrible, tragic situation with one of my clients this year. And shortly afterwards, I had someone reach out to me that needed to change birth plans. And it wasn't exactly free birth, it was a little bit different, but I was just not in the right emotional space to enter the birth space with peace, with joy, with the presence that I knew that this client deserved. And so I said, I'm so sorry. I'm going to have to say no. And of course I refunded her money and I had that kind of guilt of like, people please, like I should
Mhm.
just do it.
Right.
But after I said no, I was like, okay, like I honored myself, I honored my boundaries. And that's how you continue to do birth work for years and years and years, is saying no. Because if you say yes, you're going to get in situations where you're not comfortable, you're going to get burnt out, you're going to get hurt. And so it's really good to honor that no if you feel uncomfortable with a situation.
Absolutely. It's so important to just be able to have that fluidity on both sides, really.
Yes, absolutely. And if you're at a birth and if you decide to do a free birth, I do think it's really important, like Jen said, to have a pretty detailed conversation. Okay, what should we do if this happens? What do
Mhm.
you want me to do if this happens? If I start feeling uncomfortable, do you want me
Is stay
to
or
stay
go.
or go?
Hmm.
Because there might be a situation if you've been with somebody for 40 hours and they're leaking meconium and it smells like an infection and you can tell that they're febrile. Are you comfortable staying there? I would not be comfortable staying. I would be like, we need to go to the hospital or I'm going to need to go home. And so you want to kind of gauge, talk about some of this ahead of time
Hmm.
because you want to know and you want to both be on the same page. And if you guys are finding that even that conversation isn't going well, then you probably shouldn't go to the birth because it's likely that there's going to be some conflict at the birth. And the last thing you want to do is jeopardize somebody's birth experience or jeopardize your own boundaries as a birth worker.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Are there any other thoughts or questions that you have, Jen, about free birth? I'm trying to think if there's
No,
anything.
I know. That's that's where I was
Yeah.
going. Like, what else? What
Yeah.
else do we want to say about this? No, I feel like we addressed a lot of the things, and I hope that birth photographers and even doulas can hear this and, make some decisions based on what we've said today, or, learn at least a little bit if this is for them or not.
Right.
Because you are going to hear about it. It's going to come up. An inquiry is going to come through. Somebody's going to refer you. And I do think if you've done one or two free births before, and you've had good outcomes, people know that the free
Yeah.
birth, like, kind of movement. If you have a free birth, people around you probably that have had a free birth. And so you can get referred and recommended. And there's a doula here that this is what she does. She does all of the free births, and she's like a doula assistant midwife, and that's her role. And she's very happy to be in that space. And so, yeah, I think, you just have to figure out the types of birth that you feel good attending with the types of people that you feel
Right.
good attending.
Right. And there's no, like I said, this is not a black and white situation. We don't want to say here, like, oh, you should never do free births or you should
Right.
always do free births.
Right. No,
I no, it's not like that. I think everybody has
absolutely
different
not.
different values. And the most important thing is that if you decide to do it because it aligns with your values. The
Hmm.
birthing person, the birthing woman, they deserve to have somebody in their birth space that truly respects them and their choices. And so if you are feeling hesitant, then you're just not the right person, and that's okay. It's okay. It's okay. And if you are the right person, then, they can be absolutely beautiful to witness and to document. And like I said, undisturbed birth most often goes so well. And I wish that every provider had an opportunity to witness undisturbed birth because they might reconsider some of the things that they regularly do. Because, again, our bodies do birth really well, but again, nature is not always
Tricky.
kind and it can
Hmm.
be tricky and birth can be wild. And so again, back to that like messy gray. But we're happy to have the conversation. I always love when it comes up in group because I
I do
think it
too.
allows people to really think and you know, and I've found that the conversation lately, especially, has been really respectful. People
Hmm.
aren't getting upset or judgmental, but they're just listening to their inner voice and setting their own boundaries. And I think that's a really beautiful thing to see.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Everybody deserves to have respect in the birth space.
right.
And whatever choice that you make, whether it's a free birth or a planned cesarean birth, as long as you are very well educated and well informed, like, have the birth that you want. I think
Yeah,
that's really important. And I think birth photographers, like, generally feel that way. I mean,
yes,
we walk into births in hospitals and homes, in birth centers, and you can't do that if you really don't feel like everybody should have full autonomy to have their birth wherever they want.
absolutely.
And I think that's really like a special thing about birth photographers, because we're not all bringing an agenda, or not necessarily bringing an agenda. Like, it's just birth. We love birth, and we can see beauty in all aspects of it.
Absolutely. We're storytellers, and I think that we see beautiful, healing, redemptive stories in hospitals, and we see beautiful, healing, redemptive stories at home. And
Hmm.
I love that my job is to go into spaces and to find that story and bring it to the forefront of my family's memory and minds. And I think it's a really cool part of our job for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Well, do we want to end with like a when would you go to a birth?
Sure.
I don't know that I have one offhand. We can talk about one of the five that we've been to in the last 7 days.
I know. I was just trying to think of a good one. Oh, goodness. Okay, I can do one. So I was at a birth 2 nights ago, and it was like a beautiful birth. It went well. I went home. I was exhausted and slept. And there was like a similar, so it was the same midwife team. I got a text from them at 7:30 in the morning, and they said, "Hey, I'm headed to so and so's house. They are pretty sure they're in active labor." And this person was like early, like 37 weeks. And so we were kind of like not expecting this at
Right.
all. And we had been up, for a lot of the night with this other client, right? So I got this text message at 7:30. It was a second baby. When would you go?
Oh, that's tough.
I know it's
I would
tough.
probably try to check in with the client real quick if I could, but just based on that information, my gut would tell me to get up and go because if the midwife is going, you need to go. However, if you have been up all night and you're sleeping, I might have hesitated there in bed and just said, okay, if the midwife's on her way there, she's going to tell me all my stuff is right here. I know where it's at, and
Right.
I will wait and hear what she says and go. And I did a similar thing over the weekend and I didn't miss the birth, but I felt like I could have gotten there a little earlier. So I don't know. That's it. Again, like we said, it's all a gray area.
Yeah. So I
I would, let me just say, if I would have slept all night, I would have got up and
Right.
gone.
So spoiler, I missed the birth, but I did actually, I literally got the message. It was 7:30 that I got the message. I got out of bed. Ryan was like, "Do you want to make some breakfast?" I was like, "No."
Gotta
He was
go.
like, "Do you want to hack your computer?" Because I always like when I don't bring my
Wish.
computer to a birth, it's like always really long. And I was like, "No, I just gotta go." And so I literally like I left I left the shirt that I was wearing. I threw in a bra. I like literally was out of the house in 4 minutes, got in the car, drove to the birth, and I missed it by like 10 minutes, maybe. There was no way I could have made it. Like
From that phone call.
even if I left like the second that phone call, like even if I was in the car, I would have missed the birth. So anyway, it was a bummer, but it just goes to show that birth is wild. And it very
Yeah.
easily could have been like the midwife could have gotten there and been like, "Oh, she's like prodromal. She's 3 centimeters. Like we have all day." And then I would have been like hungry, without my laptop. Like both options, I think were totally within reason, but I did
Hmm.
miss the birth. And my client, I mean, they had such a beautiful birth and they were so happy. And I was there right after, placenta was still inside, all the cord, everything was beautiful. So I'm glad that I made it as quickly as I did. But, those mole tips, they can
Yep.
they can throw you for a loop for sure. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure. They all can, really. I had two primates, so
Yeah, that's true. That's true. They all
yeah.
can. There's no,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Always a surprise.
Always on your toes in this job, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys for joining us, and we can't wait to share more with you next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in. Find out more about us, our courses, and other tools for birth photography at birthbecomesyou.com. And make sure to follow along on Instagram and Facebook at Birth Becomes You. And if you love listening, make sure to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and subscribe wherever you listen. Thanks. Catch you on the flip side.